Hello, I'm Jen Goldson. I'm a planning consultant, and this is Avery Wolf from my office.
Hi, everybody. I'm the project manager for the Watertown Community Preservation Plan.
So we're really happy to be here whenever you're watching this at home. We're going to give you some information about what's going on with the Watertown Community Preservation Plan and what are the next steps. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the purpose of the project is, give you a teeny little background on CPA. We'll go through a snapshot of community context and some of your Community Preservation Act resources. And we'll talk about what we heard so far in this process from the community. And then Avery's actually going to share some information about what we've been working on with the Community Preservation Committee most lately, and that's creating a draft statement of values, guiding principles and goals so that you can weigh in on that, make sure that we're on the right track before we go and create the full draft plan for you to review. And then we'll talk a little bit more about, well, how can you review those? How do you engage? And I just want to say before I dive in too deeply, we're going to go over CPA eligibility very briefly. We're not going to do a lot of examples this time. If you saw the presentation in January, you'll know that we went through a pretty detailed explanation of eligibility. So if you either missed that or want a refresher, I would just go back to that video. It's still up on the website, and you can rewatch that presentation or portions of it. So this is Watertown's first community preservation plan that we're helping the Community Preservation Committee create. And the real question is, how will you prioritize as a community those CPA funds? What will you use those funds for? How could those funds create the most benefit for your community? How should competing interests be balanced in Watertown? And how should you decide which applications should be funded? So, boiling it down to its most simple explanation, the Community Preservation Act is a tool. It's a voluntary tool that towns either choose to opt into or not. And Watertown opted in 2016. It was created by the state in 2000. And it allows communities to create revenue that's specifically for open space and natural resources, historic resources, community housing, and outdoor recreation. And this revenue is generated through a 2% property tax surcharge in Watertown. So you get about $2 million a year. And then on top of that, the state provides an annual distribution. And that ranges, this year it's estimated to be about $250,000 for fiscal year 2021. Now, there is a requirement that 10% of the total funding must be spent or set aside in a reserve for future spending on 3 categories. So there's community housing, open space and recreation is combined into one requirement for 10%, even though there are multiple types of projects that can happen under those. And then historic preservation. And up to 5% can be used for administrative costs. It doesn't have to all be used, but it can be used. The maximum is 5%. So how do you apply for CPA funds? Well, the CPC is going to open up a funding round, and they may either do it on a rolling basis or a couple times a year or once a year. They're still going to be talking through that decision as we work with them in the coming months. But the process will be the same in general in terms of these 5 steps. So one, someone has an idea, whether it's a town official, an organization, a board or commission, or a community member. Then you need to figure out, well, who owns this property that I have an idea for? Maybe I want to see a new playground equipment on my local park. Well, you need to go to the town and ask them who has custody of this park, and then get agreement from the owner that it's okay to put in for funds and that someone in their agency is going to manage this project if you do get funds. So then you apply for funds, and there will be an official application to fill out with required documentation for you to submit. And then the Community Preservation Committee reviews all the applications and then votes to either recommend or not to recommend a project to the town council. Then the town council reviews all the projects that the Community Preservation Committee has recommended, and the town council has the ultimate say on what gets approved, what does not get approved, or maybe they want to approve something but with a less amount of funding than was recommended by the Community Preservation Committee. So in terms of what's eligible, very briefly, under community housing, you can acquire property or a property interest like a deed restriction for the purposes of community housing. You can create housing units either through conversion of existing buildings or existing houses, or you can create units through new development. You can also use the funds to preserve the affordability of existing housing units. Sometimes units that are affordable right now, they have deed restrictions that actually expire, and those units can be lost on your inventory of affordable housing. And so CPA funds can actually help preserve those as affordable for longer term. You can also support community housing by doing a number of things, but some of the examples that are most common and specifically mentioned in the definition now of support is to make housing affordable through direct payment programs, such as like a home buyer program or a rental assistant program. Sometimes people are confused and think, well, that means I can go ask the CPC for money to go buy a house or to help pay my rent, and that's not how it works. What happens is an organization or an agency who either has that kind of program already and wants to expand it, or is qualified to create a new program like that and to administer it, would ask for funds to create a program like that. So those are just some examples, and there's lots to talk about here. One thing I do want you to be aware of is that the term community housing, you notice that in the statute it doesn't use the word affordable housing, it says community housing, and that's because you can create affordable housing that's counted in the state's eyes on the state's list of what's affordable. It's called the subsidized housing inventory. You can also create other kinds of units that don't count on the affordable housing inventory or support and provide direct assistance, and that will often help households but won't create units that count on the subsidized housing inventory. Under the Community Preservation Act, you can fund housing that is affordable to households up to the median income, which is a higher income category than what would be required if you were to try to count a unit on the state's subsidized housing inventory. There's a lot to go in there to describe there about 40B and comprehensive permits and what are all the things that you need to be eligible to create those kinds of units. I'm not going to go into that kind of detail today, but there's certainly resources if you want to learn more on the town's website, as well as on an organization called chapa.org. We'll give you lots of information about 40B. And there are lots of other sites too. So let's move on to historic preservation eligibility. You can a historic resource can mean multiple things. It means a building, a structure, a vessel, real property, a document, or an artifact. Now, in order to be eligible for CPA funds, the resource needs to either be listed on the state register of historic places, and if you're not sure of your resources, you can look on the Massachusetts Historic Commission website. There's a database called MACRIS, M-A-C-R-I-S, that will tell you. If it's not on the state register, then it needs to be determined to be significant through a vote of the local historic commission. So you need to actually go to the Watertown Historic Commission and ask them, do you think this is a locally significant resource? There are 4 types of things you can do. So you can acquire property or property interests for historic resources. For example, you can acquire a preservation restriction to create long-term preservation of a property so that it can't be demolished, and exterior changes and sometimes interior changes would require review and approval. You can also preserve a resource by protecting it from harm, but you can't do maintenance, like regular painting would not be allowed. You can also restore a resource, which really means to accurately bring it back to a certain period of time. And you can rehabilitate a resource, and that's probably the most common type of thing that's done with CPA funds. And what that really does is it extends the life of the resource for its current use or for a new use. And that includes complying with building codes, bringing the building up to code, for example, or even providing more accessibility to comply with the Americans with Disability Act. Those are all examples of what you can do under rehabilitation. So for open space and natural resources, what is open space? It includes well fields, aquifers, watersheds, agricultural land, grassland, forest, wetlands, scenic vistas, and land for passive recreation, like hiking is a good example. And so what's eligible? You can also acquire property. You can acquire interest in property, like a conservation restriction or an agricultural preservation restriction. You can create new open space. You can revert property. You can tear down a building and create open space. You can also preserve existing open space and natural resources. And an example of that, it would be for example, invasive species removal is something common that's done with CPA funds. You can also, under outdoor recreation, now notice I say outdoor, you can acquire property, again, a property interest. You can create outdoor recreation facilities and opportunities. You can preserve existing, and you can rehabilitate existing outdoor recreation. So that will include parks and playgrounds, community gardens, athletic fields. But note that you cannot create or install artificial turf, and you cannot use CPA funds for stadiums or gymnasiums either. Okay, so let's move into a snapshot of just a little bit about the Watertown community and a little bit about your community preservation resources. So Watertown, looking at the age of the population, you can see in this chart that the blue bar is Watertown and the orange bar is the metropolitan Boston region. Watertown is a larger proportion of young adults ages 20 to 34 than seen in the region, and it also has a larger proportion of seniors age over 65 than seen in the region. You have a smaller proportion of people under 20, and relatively comparable for between 35 and 54 and 55 to 64. There's about 1 in 3, so about a third of all Watertown households are estimated to have low income. And what I mean by low income is I'm using people who are familiar with 40B and the state's affordable housing law will note that the term low income in this case means 80% of the AMI, of the area median income or less. And sometimes you'll see that called low moderate income. You'll see it go by different names. In the Community Preservation Act, it's defined as low income. And that is actually the threshold that the state counts on for units on the subsidized housing inventory. This is the threshold of affordability that the state counts under the 40B housing law. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those income categories here. I wanted to give you a little bit of background, not to make your eyes glaze over, hopefully, but to just give you a little insight on what these different categories are. So let's start from the low income. You see is the third line down in this matrix is 80% of the area median income. You say, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, I'll just give you some examples. It depends on household size, and it depends on what year you're asking. So this year, these are the numbers these are the thresholds. So if you are a household, you're living with one other person. So you have 2 people in your household, and you make $77,000 or less annually, your income is $77,000 or less, then you could potentially qualify for affordable housing. Now those programs look at other things like your assets too, but I'm just looking at income here and giving you some examples. If you're a household of 4, so that could be 2 adults and 2 kids, or 1 adult and 3 kids. It doesn't matter the age or makeup. It's everybody's income in that household, and if there's 4 people living there and you make $96,250 or less, you could also potentially qualify for affordable housing. There are other income categories too, and other needs as well to think about, rather than just that strict 80% or less counts on the subsidized housing inventory. There are also needs for very low income and extremely low income units that are affordable at 50% of the area median income and 30% of the area median income. And I gave you the examples of the current income thresholds for those categories as well. So household of 2, if you make $51,600 or less, you could be considered very low income. If you make $30,700 or less, then that would be considered extremely low income. And a household of 4, you can see the numbers there as well. 63,950 for very low income and 38,350 for extremely low. Now, the reason I go into this in some detail is because a lot of people don't have a really good understanding of what these income thresholds are and what CPA can fund, or even what the need of their community is. And I understand that Watertown's working on a housing production plan, so that will give a really thorough housing needs analysis. But from what we can tell with the limited research we did as part of the community preservation plan, you do have a need for housing at different income thresholds. And you can see that there's an estimated 12% of all households in Watertown have extremely low income and could potentially qualify for affordable housing for extremely low income households. About 7% of households have very low income, and about 14% have low income. And in terms of, I said before in an earlier slide that CPA can actually fund higher incomes than what would be counted as affordable housing under the state's housing law. It can go up to the median income. And so in Watertown, that moderate income of 100% for a household of 4 would be about $119,000. And that is about 8% of your community would fall into that, between 80% and 100% of the area median income. And I also gave you the figure for how many, that 12% of extremely low income households, how many households is that? It's about an estimate of 1,835 households. So what happens when you are a low income household or a moderate income household and you're spending more than 30% of your total gross income toward housing costs? Well, that means that you're considered by housing professionals and planners and a lot of different funding programs to be cost burdened. And so you may wonder, well, what does that mean? You know, why do I care about that? Well, when you don't have when you're cost burdened, what we think is it means you're not in a financially sustainable situation with your housing. And so it spreads your income too thin. It erodes your disposable income. You're spending so much for your housing costs, whether it's your mortgage or it's your rent and utilities, that you don't have a lot of other money left over for things like transportation or even spending money at local businesses. So it erodes your disposable income. And it also can increase your chance of losing your home, especially if you're low income, very low income, and extremely low income. The risk gets greater and greater. And this has really been both illuminated and exacerbated through the health pandemic, that more and more people are at risk of losing their homes. So I want to mention that Watertown has an existing affordable housing inventory that the state counts on, something called the subsidized housing inventory, of 1,171 units. Now, Watertown's already in safe harbor because you've met another requirement of the state. It's called GLAM. It's a land area requirement of 1.5% of your total land area that's used for affordable housing. The units that you actually have is 1,171. And you can see when you hear planners and housing professionals say that 10% is usually not enough housing, you usually have a much greater need than 10% of your year-round housing stock would achieve. And one of the things that we look at as planners is, well, how many households in your community are actually paying too much for rent, not in a financially sustainable home, and what is their income? And so you can see that the estimated percent of cost-burdened households in Watertown who have incomes that could qualify for housing that can be created through the CPA of 100% of the area median income or lower. The percent of households that are paying too much for housing in that income is 66% of all households. So that's 2 out of every 3 households that could potentially qualify for housing that can be created under the CPA are spending more than that 30%. So that's over 4,000 households. And that includes 1,300 households who have extremely low income. So let's also talk through a little bit about what it costs to create housing. Elodia Thomas, who is Watertown's Community Preservation Chair, provided some local information that she wanted us to share with you. So 1 acre of commercial property in Watertown is roughly, has a value of roughly $6 million. And a 5,000 square foot lot in a residentially zoned area that allows two-family housing that could be developed potentially is worth roughly $600,000. Per unit building cost for affordable housing, Elodia found an estimate in talking with organizations and some colleagues in the field would be roughly in recent times about $450,000 to $500,000 per unit to create a unit of affordable housing, and that's in addition to the land costs. She also wanted us to note that larger projects are generally more cost effective or cost efficient. So I wanted to demonstrate how CPA funds are often used to really leverage. It's often used as demonstration of local support in order to get much larger funding from other sources. So this is an example of a pro forma that was run for a project in Provincetown. In this one, they were trying to create 38 affordable rental units, and they are running in the pro forma for sources a construction loan, a commercial construction loan of about $920,000, federal low-income housing tax credit equity of about $6.7 million, state funds from the Department of Housing and Community Development and the Affordable Housing Trust Fund of about $3 million. And then the gap that they would need to fund, they would ask for CPA funds to cover that, and that would be about $619,000. So if you look at the total project cost, you can see that it's about $11.2 million to create those 38 affordable units. But if you look at how it's spread out over different funding sources, the CPA is being asked to fund roughly $16,000 per unit, and the state's being asked to fund about just under $80,000 per unit. So this is just giving you a little example of how CPA funds can be leveraged to fund these larger projects with other subsidies. We'll give you another example of that for open space acquisitions as well. Let's give you a short description of some of your historic resources in Watertown. So there are 901 documented historic resources, but I would say that you have many more historic resources that are undocumented. And this list would include buildings, cemeteries, objects, and structures, but note that before I also said that documents and artifacts are also historic resources. So you have a lot of historic resources in Watertown. It's a very historic community. You also have 7 properties that already have a preservation restriction. That means that, even if they're privately held by a nonprofit or another private entity, any exterior changes would need to be reviewed. You cannot demolish the building or the resource. And sometimes interior changes also need to be reviewed and approved. And here's the name I gave you before, the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System. That's MACRIS, where I said you can find a lot more information. Watertown has 3 historic districts: the Mount Auburn Street Historic District, the Watertown Arsenal Historic District, and the Charles River Reservation Parkways. And there are 267 sites that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. 2 of those are actually National Historic Landmarks, which is the absolute highest designation in this country. And the sites really range from the 17th century to the 21st century, including the Abraham Brown House and others. And so, as I said before, Watertown's very historic, and it really spans many periods of importance in the history of the development of the community. So a little bit about open space resources. Of the total 521 acres of open space in Watertown, 200 acres are permanently protected. That's about almost 53% of all the open space in Watertown is permanently protected. And then about another 52% or so has limited protection. And you could see that this isn't adding up to 100. Some of these categories are actually overlapping here, but you also have some land that's not protected at all. So the other thing we look at is natural resources and protection of natural resources. So one thing about Watertown in particular is that you have a really rich industrial past, which has even continued to this day of ongoing environmental challenges. And this is related to stormwater management, but also contamination, soil and water contamination. And so there are lots of opportunities for potential cleanup and improvements and protection of natural resources as well within that open space category, in addition to protecting open space land. Here's an example of the deal I was talking about. So in open space, you can also leverage, and it's much more common to see projects that leverage multiple funding sources when you're trying to buy or save open space. So this is an example in Middleborough. In this project, they needed about $435,000, and the CPA funds they were requesting made up about 36% of that total project cost. They were also looking for a land grant, which you can get through the state of Massachusetts, and they went through also a small grant from something called the Taunton River Stewardship Council. This is in the Middleborough area. And then they also asked for from the Nature Conservancy, which is a very large organization that does also sometimes provide grants to communities as well as other help in negotiating deals. So this is just an example of how CPA funds can be leveraged to fund larger projects. Let's talk a little bit about outdoor recreation. You have approximately 89 acres of either limited or permanently protected recreation land. And we also look at, do you have enough recreation land? And so the acreage level of service standard that determines whether a community has enough parkland for the community's population is about 10 acres per 1,000 people. And so you've already looked at this. We just pulled this from one of your other documents where you looked at, well, does Watertown actually have enough recreation land to support the amount of people that live here? And the answer is no, you don't. There's about 3.7 acres of recreation land per 1,000 people. The town has also acknowledged in its planning documents the need to continue working to meet the American with Disabilities Act standards and making recreation more accessible to people of all needs and mobility. Okay, so Avery, why don't you take it over here and talk about what we've heard from the community so far? And I'm gonna put myself on mute, but I will still forward your slides.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I just want to give you all a snapshot of what we've heard so far. We've had several in-person events and online events so far in the project, including a community forum that we had in late January, which was a great success. We had a great turnout. Thank you to everybody who came and is now watching this recording and participating in yet another way. We've had a community survey running. It was launched on that same day as the forum, and it's been running. We were planning to close it at the end of May, but we've decided to extend that survey period. So it's going to be open through the beginning of July. We're going to close it on July 9th. So I'll give you just a snapshot of what we've heard so far in that process. We also had a series of stakeholder focus groups in March. That were a great success. We had 3 different sessions with different stakeholders in the community, a really discussion-based activity along with some idea generation. And then we also have our project website, which we're adding some new tools to, but we've had a little bit of activity on the site so far in the project. So when we do these kinds of outreach events and really want to get feedback from the community, what we like to look for is priorities and where we need to balance needs and ideas in the community, both between these different CPA categories and within each one. So this is giving you a sense of, looking at prioritization between the different CPA categories. This one is from the community survey. And as you can see, open space and passive recreation were the top priority, or was the top priority for respondents of the survey. At 67%, active recreation and community housing were pretty equal, coming in around 40%. And then historic preservation was a little bit of a lower priority for the respondents of the survey at 16%. And then there were some people that weren't sure, they felt like it maybe was case specific or case dependent. They felt like everything was important, or they needed more information to be able to, really say what they felt like their priority was. So just looking at comparison, we asked a similar question at our first forum in January. And again, open space and natural resources was the top priority. A few other things were switched around a little bit here. Community housing came in as a higher priority at 26%, historic preservation, and then outdoor recreation actually received the lowest support and prioritization here for this activity. So another thing, as I mentioned, that we look at is prioritization and idea generation within each of these categories. So on the left is ideas that we presented to respondents in the survey that we asked them to prioritize. So we gave them a set of options, typical types of projects that happen in talking with the Community Preservation Committee and other, leaders in the community and community members trying to think about what types of projects could you see happening? What are the typical types of things that, maybe would be used or maybe CPA funds would be used for. And so we asked people to rank those and prioritize those options. And you'll see that, these are in order as people ranked them in the survey. And then on the right, there's just some other ideas that came out of, both in comments that people left on the survey, from the community forum, and from our stakeholder focus groups. Just some other ideas, a lot of the same ideas that are represented on the left-hand column, were also brought up at those other events. These are just additional ideas that came up beyond what's listed on the left. So as you can see, providing preservation specifically for municipal buildings was a top priority. A really big thing that came up in a lot of the conversations is making sure that the public has access to all of these resources. And then, some other ideas here, adaptively reusing historic structures. And yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So again, same setup here. On the left, you can see that for open space and recreation, preserving and restoring wetlands and wild areas. I think specifically there's a lot of discussion about the ponds and the Charles River, and trying to make those spaces more accessible and bringing them up to a higher standard and really trying to preserve those resources, since I know there's a scarce amount of open space in the community. Again, acquiring and creating new green space, similar. So these are just some of the ideas that came up in, for open space. For recreation, some of the top priorities were creating new parks and playgrounds and fields, specifically in areas where there maybe are fewer recreation amenities already. Rehabilitating and upgrading, bringing park equipment and playgrounds and fields up to a higher standard and prolonging their lifespan, and then expanding and creating new trails and paths. Next slide, there we go. So taking all of that input that we've heard so far, one of the things that we are doing with that information and what we've done at this point in the project is we've drafted a value statement, a set of guiding principles, and a set of goals for each CPA category. And ultimately, when these are finalized, they'll be incorporated into the plan, and they will be used by the CPA to guide the application process and the decision process about how CPA funds will be used. And this has been a really collaborative process between our team and the Community Preservation Committee and Watertown CPA coordinator. So just to give you a sense, and so that we're all on the same page about what these things are and what they mean, we've provided some definitions here. Values are qualities or measures of what an individual or community determines to be important. Guiding principles are fundamental standards that guide towards and support as a desired outcome. And the goals are the conditions that you're aiming for that, once they're achieved, would result in that desired outcome. Next slide. So here are just some main bullet points. The value statement is really a narrative paragraph text, and all of this material will be posted on the website. We really encourage you to go there and look at it thoroughly, but we just wanted to provide here a sense of some of the key values and components of that value statement that are incorporated, and really, the CPC, and based on the feedback we've heard, we feel are really important and foundational to how this fund and this really great resource is used. In terms of guiding principles, again, this is just a snapshot. They are separated into two different subcategories. One is based on, prioritizing projects that are consistent with community needs and values related to the value statement. So for example, making sure that projects are consistent with local planning documents and studies that really demonstrate and provide information about what those needs are in the community, and making sure that there's consistency there. The other section for the guiding principles is really about using CPA funding strategically. So, similarly to what Jen was talking about with leveraging the CPA fund and pairing it with other sources of funding, but also here's an example about how, the CPC really wants to prioritize projects that and applications that really demonstrate feasibility and experience and expertise in project management, projects that demonstrate a reasonable and informed project budget and project timeline, and really show a maintenance plan for the future, so that the investment in that resource is going to be sustained long into the future. Again, these are just some examples from some of the goals. As I said before, there's a set of goals for each of we've separated recreation and open space, so each of the 4 different CPA categories. I would say there's 4 to 8 different goals for each section. It varies a little bit, but these are just some examples. So for open space, one example is increase and improve access to and connectivity between current and future open space resources. For recreation, create and expand bicycle and pedestrian paths to connect neighborhoods with recreational and community resources. For community housing, support income and demographic diversity by funding the creation of housing based on documented needs. And for historic preservation, preserve and restore town-owned historic resources, including buildings, landscapes, monuments, documents, and artifacts. So this is the exciting part. This is where we tell you how you can, use your voice to be involved in this process. If you want to go to the next slide, Jen. This is just a quick snapshot, kind of a rough overview of our tentative timeline. With the pandemic and everything that's going on, we're a little bit unsure about how things will pan out over the next few months, but this is our goal. So we are, aiming to have a public hearing for the full plan in September. And we are posting new content on the website in mid-June, and that content will be up and running. There are lots of interactive tools, which I'll describe in a second, for the community to give feedback, and we're going to have that open for comments and discussions through July 9th. And there's a webinar, which this video is a part of, that will be happening on June 25th. And then we'll be, taking what we hear and making revisions and really compiling everything into the full plan and associated products and application processes, and putting that out for public comment in early September. So keep an eye out for that. So this is our project website. We've just added a bunch of new content and new tools. This is the home page. And one thing that's important to note is that all of the information is available to anybody, and you can choose how involved you want to be. So anybody can view any of the content, but if you want to participate in any of the conversations or give feedback, we do ask that you register on the site. And we do this just because it protects us and the site, it protects us from potential robots or hackers or other potential problematic activity. And it also helps us get a sense of, who is participating in these conversations, who is responding. And that's really helpful and a best practice for this type of, work. And we protect all your information. There's very few questions. You have to provide very little, but none of that information will be shared. It's a very safe process. So we really encourage you to sign up and register and, really join the conversation and be involved. So there are several different pages that you can access from this homepage. Some of them have informational materials. Some of them have interactive tools, as I was describing. If you go to the next slide, Jen, I think there's another, an example of, so this is what the pages with the goals and or guiding principles and value statements will look like. There's different pages for each different section of these materials. And at the top, there will be information that you can read through, the actual full material for you to look through. And then at the bottom, there are several different question prompts and an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So we really encourage you to, visit the site, click around on all the pages, explore everything, learn, and register and participate in the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and for those of you who got to the end. So hopefully you'll have some questions that you'll participate in the webinar that we'll be doing in a few weeks, or you'll participate online. And if you have questions, please do let us know. Thank you so much.